You've learned a lot. You've read, you've studied, you've invested time, money, and attention over the last years. And for a while, it felt good. You understood more. You can explain things more clearly. You felt like you were doing what capable people do. But then the moment no one really talks about, the moment when learning didn't turn into a steadiness, it didn't turn into an embodiment and implementation. When knowing more didn't make decisions easier. When you found yourself hesitating, not because you lacked the information, but because nothing you knew was helping you move. That's usually when the doubt starts. Not loud doubt, but quiet ones. You start wondering if education actually works, if structured learning was even worth it, if maybe the people saying it's a waste of time were right. And that's where this episode begins, because there's a very particular frustration that comes from knowing you're educated, knowing you've done the work, and still not trusting yourself when it matters. What makes this harder is a story you're hearing right now, that education is unnecessary, it's a scam, the structured learning is outdated, that real builders and creators do not need this. That if education hasn't translated into confidence yet, it must have been a waste of time. That story doesn't show up randomly. It usually shows up right after effort, right after you've tried to do things the right way and it didn't get the internal stability you were expecting. And that moment, dismissing education feels completely reasonable. It feels relieving. But that relief comes at a cost. Because that story is appealing and it's mostly untrue. Not because education automatically makes you capable, because it doesn't, but because dismissing it lets you avoid the most demanding part of your growth. What education was actually meant to do. Education was never meant to make you feel certain. It was never about having an answer ready for everything that comes your way. It was meant to stretch how you think and how you hold pressure when decisions aren't obvious. That's uncomfortable. It asks you to stay with complexity way longer than your instincts want to. It asks you to sit inside questions without rushing to resolve them. It asks you to let your thinking mature instead of constantly moving on. And if your priority is building a business that actually funds your life, not the one that keeps you worried about cash flow, not the one that keeps you anxious about payroll, when your next opportunity is going to come up, then avoiding that challenge isn't intuition, it's actually delay. When education is entered and completed properly, it doesn't make you louder, it makes you powerful. It positions you for success. So here's what the misunderstanding about learning is. Most people were taught to treat education like accumulation. You get more information, you get more credentials, more frameworks, more perspectives, and you feel confident for a while. Yeah, it works. You feel sharper, more articulate, more capable of explaining what you know. But explanation isn't the same as orientation and positioning. At some point, learning stops adding clarity and starts adding noise, especially when you decided to get into an educational structure that wasn't even aligned with your identity or wants or visions in the first place. Not because education failed, but because it was never meant to carry you on its own. This is where people get confused, and I understand. Because no one really explains what comes after learning or even during. There's a whole strategy. So here's why it hasn't converted yet. What rarely gets said is this: learning doesn't pay off when it's external. When it lives as a language you can repeat, but not something you operate from. So instead of trusting yourself more, you start checking yourself against what you've learned. You look for confirmation, you second guess instincts, you delay decisions until you've read one more thing, listened to one more person, mapped out one more perspective. Slowly, knowledge becomes something you consult instead of something you embodied. That's when education starts to feel useless, even though it isn't. And if you've been here, it makes sense that you feel frustrated. Nothing about this means you did something wrong. The missing step most people never name is what's usually missing isn't effort, it's integration, it's embodiment, it's strategy, it's positioning. It's how you use your education to position you for the things you wanted. The point where what you've learned reshapes how you decide, what you tolerate, what kind of relationships you get into, and what you no longer debate internally. Until that happens, learning stays theoretical, helpful, but not grounding. You sound smart, you understand the landscape, but you don't feel settled in yourself. You don't feel whole within yourself. Something feels like it's missing. And if that's been your experience, you're not imagining it. Why smart leaders turn against education. This is why so many capable people quietly start doubting themselves. Not because they lack intelligence, and it's not because you lack discipline, which I'm sure you can kind of brush up on that part, but because they've been taught to keep learning without ever being shown how to complete a learning phase. So education becomes this endless preparation. And preparation, when it never turns into embodiment, creates uncertainty instead of confidence. That's usually the moment when people say education is a scam, that you should drop out as soon as possible. Not because education failed, not at all, but because it was expected to do something it was never designed to do. Just because you're educated doesn't mean you're poof, this powerful, confident person that knows everything. Education was never meant to complete you or validate you or hand you a finished identity. Education isn't something you collect to feel worthy, and it's not something you abandon once you feel confident. It's a phase, a deliberate season where you install what's missing so the next phase can actually stick and hold and grow and compound. When education is entered that way, with intention, with boundaries, and an endpoint, it becomes stabilizing instead of disorientating. A lot of people try to keep up with the keep ups as they're getting educated, as they're building their intelligence. But it's about grounding instead of being overwhelmed. So let's take this gentle pause and join the refining table. If you're at the refining table with this episode, notice this quietly. Does your education feel unfinished? Does your education simply feel unclaimed? No need to answer out loud, just notice what comes up. If your education hasn't paid off yet, it doesn't mean it was a mistake. It means it's unfinished, and dismissing it will not free you. And completing the phase will. We'll keep refining from here.